Hello everyone, my name is David Lutchford and today I'm going to be teaching you the 9th lesson of my Ancient Greek course, which is on contract verbs. We're going to be specifically looking at contract verbs in relation to the present indicative active, which we learned about last time. Let me begin by saying that with what you learned last time, you can conjugate a lot of verbs in or in the present indicative active. However, you cannot yet conjugate them all. In particular, you cannot yet conjugate verbs with stems ending in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. And this is because verbs with stems ending in alpha, epsilon, or omicron are what are called contract verbs, because this final vowel in their stem, alpha, epsilon, or omicron, contracts with the vowel or diphthong of the person ending. Here is an example of a contract verb. Hora'or is the verb to see. And you can see, no pun intended, that we have the stem hora and the person ending or. And this is the form you would find this verb in a dictionary. However, in many Greek texts, you would not find it in this uncontracted form. And that's because in the Greek we're learning, which is Attic Greek from the classical period, this concluding alpha in the verb stem would contract with the or, with the omega in the person ending. The end of the stem contracts with the vowel, or later the diphthong, found in the person ending. Well, as we shall learn, when a concluding alpha in a verb stem meets omega in a person ending, they contract to form or. So, omega defeats alpha. You could think of it like that if you want. So you're just left with omega. So I see, in an ancient Greek text, would be horor. Horor. I see or I am seeing. And you can see that this omega in the contracted form has a circumflex above it. I talked about the circumflex in an earlier lesson, so I hope you remember this squiggle. And it's very useful to note that a vowel or diphthong resulting from a contraction of a vowel with another vowel or a diphthong often has a circumflex above it. Not always, but often. So if you see what you know is a verb with an ending that's got a circumflex above it, it's worth questioning whether a contraction has taken place. Overall then, here you have the uncontracted form, hora'or, and here you have the contracted form, horor. And it's almost as if the concluding vowel in the stem has mixed with omega to make omega alone. And learning how to conjugate contract verbs in Greek consists of learning what happens when one vowel meets another vowel or a diphthong. And remember, these rules of contraction only apply to verbs whose stems end in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. If a verb stem ends in another vowel, like upsilon, then no contraction takes place. A contraction only happens when a verb stem ends in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. But we're now going to look at this in more detail, and we're going to learn how to do all of the necessary contractions so that you can conjugate any verb in or in the present indicative active. Let's now look at how to fully conjugate hora'or in the present indicative active. So we already know that in the first person singular, hora, the verb stem, plus the person ending or makes horor in the contracted form. In the second person singular, you have the stem hora, plus the person ending ace, which we learned last time. So, hora plus ace makes horais. Horais. You can see that the epsilon is lost in the contraction, but the iota goes subscript and goes beneath the alpha. And to keep the meaning of these verb forms in mind, horais would mean you singular see or you singular are seeing. What about hora plus a? I've written hor, but before I finish writing this, you might actually be able to predict this one. If hora plus ace makes horais, what do you think hora plus a will make, without the sigma at the end? The stem hora plus the person ending a makes horai, which means he, she, or it sees or is seeing. Hora plus omen makes horomen, which means we see or we are seeing. And in all of these forms, you can see you've got a circumflex above the vowel resulting from the contraction. Note that that's not always the case. That doesn't happen every time, but it's quite a useful indicator or hint that a contraction has taken place. Although, of course, a circumflex can be used for lots of other things, so not every circumflex signifies a contraction. How about this second person plural form, hora plus ete? Hora plus ete. Well, here, the alpha and the epsilon contract with each other to make a long alpha, so the ending is horate. Horate, meaning you plural see or you plural are seeing. Finally, how about hora plus uusin? Hora plus uusin makes horosin, meaning they see or they are seeing. So you can see how in each of these cases, the verb stems concluding alpha contracts with the vowel or the diphthong in the person ending to form a new vowel. And at this point, you might be wondering, David, how am I going to learn how all of these vowels and diphthongs contract with each other? How on earth am I ever going to remember the result of every single combination of vowel and diphthong? Well, there are two ways to do this. The first way you might do this is by remembering lots of different paradigms to remember what happens for alpha contract verbs and for epsilon contract verbs and for omicron contract verbs in different tenses, because contraction happens not only in the present indicative active but also in other conjugations as well. So option one is to remember a lot of different paradigms to remember what happens when the various vowels and diphthongs meet each other. But there is a second way which I prefer and I'm going to show you now. The other way of learning how to conjugate contract verbs is to memorize this table. And now I know it looks intimidating, okay? This is a slightly modified version of the table of contraction that you can find in Jact's amazing reading Greek course. That's Jact, spelled J-A-C-T. I've mentioned several times that that's the course that I used to learn Greek. So this is a slightly modified version from that. I modified it when I first learned it because I found that the order of vowels they use in the table is slightly unintuitive, so I put them in what I think is a more intuitive order. But anyway, if you want to know how to conjugate contract verbs, the second way, and my preferred way, is to learn this table. Now, how does this table work? Well, at this side, you have alpha, epsilon, and omicron, the three contract vowels. These are the three possible vowels that you might find at the end of a verb stem, which will contract with a verb's person ending. So, in this left column, you've got the three contract vowels. And along the top row, you have got all of the vowels, or diphthongs, which these three vowels can possibly contract with. So for instance, in the case of hora'or, if you wanted to find out how hora'or would look in its contracted form, you could look at alpha, since the verb stem ends in alpha, and then you could find or here, because that's what's being added to the alpha in the person ending, and you would see the result, if you follow it along and down, is or. As we saw, horror means I see or I'm seeing. It's the contracted form of hora'or. So you can see the way this works. If you have a verb whose stem ends in epsilon and you want to add the person ending a, epsilon iota, you could follow them and find that epsilon plus a makes a, epsilon iota. So the epsilon is essentially replaced with epsilon iota. Similarly, if you had a verb whose stem ended in omicron and you wanted to find out what happens if that omicron contracts with, let's say, the person ending omen, starting with omicron, then you would look at omicron and you would look at omicron here and you would follow the column down and the row across to find that omicron plus omicron makes oo. So the person ending would look like oomen rather than omen. So you can see how this works. You've got the contract vowels here, and you've got all of the possible vowels or diphthongs they may meet and then contract with here. So you start here, and then this is the vowel or diphthong that you're adding to this vowel. And here, in this section, are all of the resulting contractions. So alpha plus alpha makes alpha, alpha plus epsilon also makes alpha, and so on. So if you commit this table to memory, then you'll be able to do any contraction you need to do in ancient Greek. Well, in the ancient Greek that we're learning at least, which is the Attic dialect of classical Greek. Please note that the table I'm currently showing you in the video is for the Attic dialect of classical Greek, okay? It won't work for all ancient Greek. Because in other dialects of classical Greek, the resulting contractions differed from those found in Attic Greek. And on top of that, in some dialects, in certain instances, contraction did not happen at all. So please remember that this information about contraction is for the Attic dialect of classical Greek only. So if you commit this table to memory, then you'll be able to do any contraction. You will know how alpha, epsilon and omicron contract with any vowel or diphthong they may meet and therefore contract with. You will know what the resulting vowel or diphthong is. So if you remember this table, you can do any contraction you need to do in ancient Greek. Not just in the present indicative active, but in other tenses where you also need to know how vowels contract. So if you commit this to memory at an early stage, it will serve you very well for the rest of your Greek learning. But you might think, how on earth do I memorise this huge table? Because it does seem like quite a difficult task when you first see it. It looks quite intimidating, right? But if you look at each row in isolation, then it makes it easier to remember the resulting vowel or diphthong of each combination. If we look at the alpha row, there are patterns we will notice that help us to remember the table. We see that for the first 5 contractions, the result is alpha or alpha with an iota subscript. And that's easy to remember because we can say that in the first 5, the vowel will be alpha unless the vowel it meets with involves iota. So, alpha plus alpha is alpha, alpha plus epsilon is alpha, but alpha plus epsilon iota is alpha with iota subscript I, alpha plus eta is alpha, and alpha plus eta iota, since it involves iota subscript, is alpha with iota subscript. So for the first 5, it's alpha or alpha with iota subscript, and you can remember to add an iota subscript to the alpha if the vowel or diphthong it meets with involves alpha. Now, the 6th combination is where alpha meets with iota itself. And in this case, it's very straightforward. Just picture alpha with iota itself. It makes the very same diphthong, alpha and iota. You literally just stick these 2 letters together to make I, the diphthong alpha iota. Now, if we look at the last 5 in the alpha row, you can see they're either all omega or they're omega with iota subscript. And this is because a similar rule applies to the one we found in the first 5 contractions. Here, when alpha meets a vowel or diphthong involving an O sound, whether it's omicron or omega, the resulting vowel is omega. But you need to put an iota subscript beneath this omega if the O sound also involves an iota. So you can see the diphthong oi, when added to alpha, gives us omega with iota subscript. And likewise, alpha plus omega with iota subscript is omega with iota subscript. So you can divide it up into the first 5 for alpha, which are all alpha or alpha with iota subscript, the middle one on its own, which is alpha and iota, the diphthong, and then the last 5, which are all omega or omega with iota subscript. And you can remember to add the iota subscript in the case of the first 5 and the last 5 because of the presence of an iota in the vowel or diphthong that it meets with. So the alpha row is quite straightforward to remember. Let's look at the epsilon row now. The epsilon row is a bit trickier to commit to memory. You can break it down into 2 halves. The first 6 contractions all involve an E sound in some sense, whether it's eta, epsilon iota, or eta with iota subscript, okay? The first 6 contractions are one of those 3, eta, epsilon iota, or eta with iota subscript. It's interesting to note that epsilon, when it's at the end of a verb stem, contracts with alpha to make eta. However, when alpha is at the end of a verb stem and it meets epsilon, they contract to make alpha. So it does matter which way around you're adding the vowels together, whether it's epsilon plus alpha or alpha plus epsilon, as you can see. But you can memorise these first 6 in the epsilon row in any way you find useful. You can write them out over and over again from memory, that order, or conceptually, once you study this table for a while, it begins to make sense why the vowels contract the way they do. So if we just remember that epsilon plus alpha makes eta, let's look at epsilon plus epsilon. Epsilon plus epsilon makes the diphthong A. And the way I conceive of this is it's like it's making an even stronger vowel sound. And in particular, it makes a diphthong. Okay, that's like a stronger vowel sound. It's epsilon iota rather than just epsilon. And you also see this in the omicron row. Omicron plus omicron makes the diphthong oo, omicron epsilon. Epsilon plus epsilon makes A, that stronger sound. And also, when it meets this stronger sound as a person ending, the stronger sound basically replaces it. Epsilon plus epsilon iota is epsilon iota. Likewise with omicron, omicron plus omicron upsilon is omicron upsilon. So you can conceive of it in terms of the strength of the vowels in some vague sense. It might help you remember the way the contractions happen. And then epsilon meets eta and eta with iota subscript. And here, once again, if you conceive of eta as a stronger vowel than epsilon, since it's a longer vowel, we know that eta is a long E sound, whereas epsilon is a short E sound, we can think, well, if epsilon meets eta, then eta's going to win, and it's going to be the only one left. It's the stronger vowel sound, and it kicks out or replaces epsilon. And that happens in both of these cases. Epsilon plus eta is eta, and epsilon plus eta with iota subscript is eta with iota subscript. And epsilon plus iota does the same thing as alpha plus iota, namely you just stick these two letters together and it makes epsilon iota, the diphthong. That also happens in the case of omicron plus iota, which makes omicron iota. So you could think of this middle column as being independent from the rest if you would like, even though I've said you can take the epsilon row in 2 halves, because in each case you literally just stick iota onto each of the contract vowels to make I, A, or oi. But anyway, carrying on with the epsilon row, after this 6th contraction, all of the following contractions involve an O sound. They either involve omicron or omega. Now, epsilon plus omicron makes omicron upsilon. And this is, interestingly enough, one that works the same way if you swap the order of the vowels around. So if we look, omicron plus epsilon also makes oo. But we saw that didn't happen in the case of epsilon plus alpha. And then after that point, all of the other vowel sounds, or diphthongs, are so strong that they simply overpower the epsilon and just replace it. So epsilon plus oi is oi, epsilon plus oo is oo, epsilon plus or is or, epsilon plus oi is oi. So in the case of these last 4, the added vowel or diphthong simply defeats or replaces the epsilon in the verb stem. If we look at the final row quickly, for omicron, all of the resulting vowels or diphthongs involve an O sound. They all involve omicron or omega. Omicron plus alpha makes omega. Omicron plus epsilon makes omicron upsilon, which was also the result of epsilon plus omicron, as we saw, so that is one that works both ways. Omicron plus epsilon iota makes oi. Here you could think of the stronger omicron kicking the epsilon out of the way. It gets rid of the epsilon and sits in its place. So instead of epsilon iota, you've got omicron iota. Now, a part I found difficult when I was first trying to memorise this table is what happens next, because omicron plus eta makes omega, but omicron plus eta with iota subscript makes omicron iota. So Although omicron plus eta forms omega, you do not get omega with iota subscript when you have omicron plus eta with iota subscript, which is what you would expect, I think. Instead, you have the diphthong oi. So that's tricky. In the first case, omicron and eta kind of merge to make omega, but in the second case, omicron seems to overpower eta, and it brings the iota subscript up onto the line to make the diphthong oi. And then omicron plus just iota on its own makes omicron iota, as happens with the other vowels. You literally just stick these two letters together in that middle column, which we've discussed before. Omicron plus omicron makes a stronger vowel sound. It makes a diphthong. It makes the diphthong omicron upsilon. As in the case of epsilon plus epsilon, it makes a more powerful vowel sound. It makes a diphthong. And then, as with epsilon, these last four possible additions overpower the contract vowel. So, omicron plus omicron iota is omicron iota. Omicron plus omicron upsilon is omicron upsilon. Omicron plus omega is omega. Omicron plus omega with iota subscript is omega with iota subscript. You can also break this table down in a number of other ways, and I'm sure you'll be able to find lots of different ways to memorize it. For one thing, you can remember that omega, or omega with iota subscript, always replace the vowel that they're being added to. So omega, when added to anything else, creates omega. Omega basically replaces the contract vowel that it's added to. And likewise, omega with iota subscript, when added to anything else, totally replaces it with omega with iota subscript. So alpha plus omega is omega, epsilon plus omega is omega, omicron plus omega is omega, and this kind of dominance of omega is also seen with omega with iota subscript, because when you add that to a contract vowel, it too just replaces the contract vowel. So you can break this table down in a number of ways, okay? I proposed thinking of the alpha row in terms of the first 5, the middle one on its own, and then the last 5 resulting vowels or diphthongs. And then I proposed thinking of the epsilon row in 2 halves, and then we kind of looked through the last row on a case-by-case basis, but you could also break it up into 2 parts. You could have this as one part and this as another part, since these 4 just involve simple replacement of the contract vowel by the vowel or diphthong being added to it, whereas the first 7 produce combinations that you have to remember in other ways. So for illustrative purposes, this is how I have broken it down. I broke the alpha row down into 3 parts, the epsilon row down into 2 parts, and the omicron row into those 2 parts. Anyway, there are plenty of ways of remembering this table of contraction, we might call it. But if you commit this to memory in any way you can, then you will be able to do every contraction you need to do in ancient Greek. And I would like you to note this table down. I'll put a picture of it on the screen now so you can pause and write it out, so that you have it for reference when we're doing exercises that involve vowel contraction. Now we are going to proceed to look at the paradigms for verbs with stems ending in epsilon and verbs with stems ending in omicron. But before we do so, I want to give some practical advice for learning this table. In my opinion, the best way to learn this table is to try writing it out from memory again and again on a daily basis, until you're confident you have it memorized. So begin by writing out alpha, epsilon and omicron in this far left column, and then write out the 11 vowels or diphthongs along the top row, and then simply try filling in the table from memory. So you can attempt this, and then you can look at this table and either correct your table accordingly or mark it as correct if you got every single contraction right. And you can practice writing it out from memory until you're getting every contraction correct every time. One of the most difficult things, I think, about writing it out from memory is remembering which vowels and diphthongs you need to write along the top. It helps me to remember that along this top row there are 11 vowels/diphthongs, And down here there are just the 3 contract vowels. So you should have 3 vowels in this far left column, and you should have 11 vowels / diphthongs along the top row. So if you're writing out the table from memory and you've only got 8 along the top row, then you know you've missed some vowels or diphthongs that you need to add to the table. But when you begin practicing writing this table out from memory, you may wish to allow yourself to write this out from your notes and then to just practice filling in the table, because that's really the most important part, knowing what happens when each vowel meets each diphthong or vowel. But anyway, I hope that helps you to learn this table if you are choosing to learn the table. And even if you're choosing to learn this table, it will still be useful for you to see the paradigms for epsilon contract verbs and omicron contract verbs. And if you have noted down this table, then you will see, as I go through the paradigms, that this table does in fact tell you all you need to know about how to contract these vowels with other vowels or diphthongs. The paradigm often used for epsilon contract verbs is poieor, which means I make or I do. And you can see we have it here in its uncontracted dictionary form. And I'm going to list its other uncontracted forms here, but I'm going to show you how they contract by writing down the contracted forms on this side. And remember, you can check your table to see that it does in fact tell you everything you need to know about contraction. So, what does poieor make? You can check your table and try and figure it out for yourself before I reveal it. We know that this epsilon is going to contract with the omega. So, to use your table, you would look at epsilon in the far left column and then follow it along until you meet omega in the top row and see which vowel this makes. If you did that, you will have found that epsilon plus omega makes omega. So poieor makes poior, which means I do or I am doing. And once again, that is how you would see this verb in an ancient Greek text, at least one written in the Attic dialect of classical Greek. The second person singular, poie, that's the stem, of course, plus ace, the person ending, makes poies, meaning you singular do or you singular are doing. Poie plus a contracts to poie, meaning he, she, or it does, or is doing, or makes, or is making. Remember that poieor can mean make or do, okay? It has those 2 basic meanings, make or do. In the first person plural, we have the stem poie, and the person ending omen, and poie plus omen makes, you can pause the video, look at your table of contraction and work it out, poiumen, meaning we do or we make, we are doing or we are making. The second person plural is poie plus ete, which makes poiete, meaning you plural do or you plural are doing, you plural make or you plural are making. How about poie plus the person ending uusin? If you look at your table of contraction, you will find that that makes poiusin. The u is strong and it totally gets rid of the epsilon, so it's just poiusin, meaning they do or they make or they are doing or they are making. Finally, the paradigm for verbs with stems ending in omicron is der loor, which means to show. So in the first person singular form, it means I show or I am showing. We want to find out how omicron contracts with the person endings, which, if you consult your table, you will already be able to figure out. In the first person singular, the stem der lo plus the person ending or makes der lor, meaning I show or I am showing. In the second person singular, the stem der lo plus ace results in the contracted form der lois, meaning you singular show or you singular are showing. In the third person singular, you have der lo plus the person ending a, which results in the contracted form der loi. And der loi means he, she, or it shows or is showing. In the first person plural, you would have if it did not contract, der Omen, which makes der Lumen. Which means we show or we are showing. In the second person plural, you have the stem der Lo plus the person ending ete, which makes der Lute, meaning you plural show or you plural are showing. Finally, in the third person plural, you have the stem der Lo plus the ending usin, and omicron plus omicron upsilon gives you omicron upsilon, and therefore you get der Lusin. So you have now seen a paradigm for verbs with stems ending in alpha, namely hora'or. You've seen one for verbs with stems ending in epsilon, namely poie'or. And finally, you've seen one for verbs with stems ending in omicron, namely der lo'or. And I would say these are the three most popular paradigms used in textbooks. And you can learn how to contract vowels with other vowels or diphthongs by memorizing these paradigms. However, I think the more straightforward way is to learn the table of contraction, but it's up to you. People learn differently. In any case, it's still useful to see these paradigms because they show you contraction in action. I'm a poet and I did not know it. Okay, I would now like you to learn some new vocabulary. I'm going to write 5 contract verbs on the board, and I would like you to at least note them down and ideally learn them, because they're going to be used in the next exercise to test your knowledge of contraction. Okay, here are our 5 verbs. The first one, nika'or, means to win or to conquer. There's a noun, niker, which means victory, and it's where we get the word Nike from, or Nike, depending on however you want to say it. I know there's a dispute about that, which I think the brand has publicly addressed, but I'm not sure which way they decided on it. I'll have to check. And this is an alpha contract verb because you can see the stem, nika, ends in alpha. The second verb, aporre'or, means to be at a loss. It's when you're perplexed or bewildered and you don't know how to proceed. And you can see this is an epsilon contract verb because the stem ends in epsilon. The third verb is zderte'or, which means to seek. Once again, you can see it's an epsilon contract verb. The fourth verb is another epsilon contract verb, and it means to go. It's another verb to go. There are quite a few of those in Greek, as I think I said in the last lesson. Finally, you've got an omicron contract verb, doulo'or, which means to enslave. So please note these down and ideally try to learn them, but at any rate have them noted down to refer to if you need to when we're doing the exercise that I'm about to put on the board now. Okay, to finish this lesson, as usual we have an exercise. We have 10 different verbs here. Please write them out and then write their English translation next to them. You may be able to do this without consulting your resources, but if you feel like you need to, which is totally understandable considering this is all new to you, then please consult your list of vocabulary and either the table of contraction or the paradigms for verbs with stems in alpha, epsilon, or omicron. So please pause the video and attempt this exercise. Okay, final warning because the answers are about to be revealed. Firstly, corre means he, she, it goes, or he, she, it is going. The epsilon in the verb stem has contracted with epsilon iota to make epsilon iota. Corre, he, she, it goes, or he, she, it is going. Secondly, nikorsin means they win or they conquer, or they are winning or they are conquering. The alpha has contracted with the omicron upsilon in the ending usin to make omega. Thirdly, horais means you singular see or you singular are seeing. The alpha in the stem hora has contracted with epsilon iota to make alpha with iota subscript. Poiumen means we make or we do, or we are making or we are doing. The epsilon has contracted with omicron to make omicron upsilon. Zdertor means I seek or I am seeking. The epsilon has contracted with omega to make omega. omega always wins in these situations. Du lute means you plural enslave or you plural are enslaving. The omicron has contracted with the epsilon to make omicron upsilon. Aporeis means you singular are at a loss. The epsilon in the stem has contracted with the epsilon iota in the ending ace to make a. That is epsilon iota. Der loi means he, she, or it shows or is showing. The omicron's contracted with the ending epsilon iota to make the ending oi instead. Korusin means they go or they are going. It's korre plus usin. The epsilon has contracted with the u to make u. Finally, nikor means I win or I conquer, or I am winning or I am conquering. And that is what you're doing if you got 10 out of 10 on this exercise. Please keep up the good work. If you got 10 out of 10, you can say nikor, you can say I win or I conquer. Finally, please note that there are some exceptions to what I've just taught you, even within Attic Greek. Certain verbs do not contract in certain forms. Some epsilon contract verbs with monosyllabic stems, that is, stems with just one syllable, only contract when the person ending being added to the stem begins in epsilon. If the person ending doesn't begin in epsilon, then no contraction takes place. One of these verbs is the verb pleor, which means to sail. In the first person singular, in an ancient Greek text, this will be found as pleor, in its uncontracted form. However, if you have pleis, that is, you singular are sailing, then you would find this as place. A contraction would take place, because the person ending begins in epsilon. Another example is the verb pneor, which means I breathe. In the first person singular, you would find it as pneor, uncontracted. However, in the second person singular, pneis, you would find it as pneis, contracted. So there are some exceptions to these rules of contraction, even within Attic Greek. But for the most part, in fact, in the overwhelming majority of cases in Attic Greek, these rules of contraction do apply. But alas, we are now out of time. I will see you again for lesson 10, which I think will be on something other than verbs, but I think you've got a lot to practice with here, especially with that table of contraction. That's what I'm talking about. Please keep up the good work, and I shall see you next time.